has been just a wave of opposition to this legislation. The only support for it, the only open support, I should say, is coming from representatives of conservative think tanks.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
McKenna Schueler is a reporter for the Orlando Weekly. She has been reporting on the Disney negotiations and as well as some of the anti-union stuff going on in the legislature in Florida. McKenna, thanks for taking the time to talk to us this morning.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me on. Really excited to be here.
Absolutely. Excited to have you. You've been doing some great stuff on the Disney negotiations in particular. That's what I've been following most closely from your work. And the last time that we spoke about this a month ago, 6 weeks ago, something like that, Disney workers had just voted down a deal by, what was it, 96% offered by Disney. Was that right? Is that right?
Yeah, it was about 14,000, a little over 14,000 workers that voted, and of that, 96% voted it down. And that was Disney's so-called best offer, which evidently wasn't their best.
Right. It's, the last best and final is always is very rarely actually the last best and final offer. So they voted it down by a wide margin, and after that, the negotiators for both sides came back to the table, and what do you know, there is a better offer on the table, and that offer has been tentatively accepted by the bargaining committee of the unions. It hasn't gone to a vote by the members yet, right?
No, that's going to be next Wednesday.
Yeah, so it hasn't been accepted by the members, and so it's important to understand that a tentative agreement is just, more or less, the bargaining committees for the unions are saying, yes, this is a good deal, we recommend people ratify it. Whereas before, the bargaining committees of the unions were actually campaigning against accepting the contract, right?
Yep.
Yeah,
that's true.
So definitely a different, and so obviously this deal has come a long way, at least in the eyes of the negotiators for the unions. And so talk to us about the difference between the contract that was voted down and the contract that Disney employees are going to be voting on this week.
Yeah, so even between that, there was another offer that Disney came back with after the 96% rejection. And that ended up actually being a worse offer, where the first offer was a $1 pay raise in the first year for many workers. Mm-hmm. And that was overwhelmingly rejected. Then Disney came back, and that would have raised the minimum wage, for instance, from 15 to 16. Then Disney came back and said, okay, we'll do 17 this year, but they reduced the retroactive pay for workers. So Paul Cox, president of IATSE Local 631, which represents some of the workers there, the way he described it, just kind of like moving around the furniture. It's just the same money, but it would have been a worse deal. So they were supposed to go back to negotiations, I think, for like 2 days, but after that first day, they just stopped. And so then there were a few weeks where there wasn't much going on, except, I shouldn't say that, but workers did hold a rally a couple weeks ago. And then, so the difference is with this new tentative agreement, it really was what, as far as wages, it was what the unions have been fighting for, is my understanding. So a $3 minimum pay raise across the board this first year in 2023. By the end of the year, that will go into effect, and then some immediate raises right away. And then over the course of the contract, it'll go up to $20.50 by October 2026, which is more than double what it was a decade ago, 2 contract cycles ago, when the minimum wage at Disney was just $10. So, and then it's my understanding as well that the wage raises, the raises over the course of the contract will range between $5.50 and I think it's $8.40. So depending on your job classification, but that's like a double-digit percentage wage increase for a lot of these workers. So that's especially in an area like Central Florida, where the cost of living has just skyrocketed. That's the difference between being able to pay rent, being able to buy food for your kids and not being able to.
Absolutely. And so what has the reaction of the members been to this, as they're preparing to vote on it?
As far as I know, it seems to be a victory. I haven't had the chance to talk to a lot of individual members yet because, unfortunately, the announcement came literally at the same time that there was a committee meeting being heard on the anti-union legislation. So I was kind of like, I wasn't able to go to the tentative agreement announcement in person, which I was really sad about.
Right.
I just kind of tuned in virtually, but yeah, I'm looking forward to within this, hopefully next week, being able to maybe get in touch with some members and talk to them about what they think about this. But I think it's widely being celebrated as a victory.
And what would you, covering this negotiation process, what would you credit to, trying to think of how to ask this, to what would you credit the victory, I guess? Why was it that Disney came from a $1 an hour raise to a $3 an hour raise in the first year? What was it that kind of forced their hand?
I mean, I'm sure it was definitely a multitude of factors, but not gonna lie, probably all the bad press didn't help. And there was a lot of just press coming, it was from national press was covering this, local news. And I know me and at Orlando Weekly, and then over at the Orlando Sentinel, which is the bigger publication here in the area, just we've found different angles to report on as far as how wages currently for Disney World workers just is not enough to make ends meet for not just individual workers, but their families as well. And actually just a couple days before the tentative agreement was announced, I did a pretty long piece. I think it's like almost 3,000 words, or maybe about 3,000 words, on specifically costuming workers at Disney World, which were represented by IATSE Local 631. And that sort of documented what the union describes as a gender pay gap, which is essentially costuming workers at Disney World who are predominantly female, not all, but predominantly, are paid less than their union siblings, stage technicians, electrical techs. That was a really interesting story that I first talked to Paul Cox, the president of that union. He first mentioned it to me weeks and weeks ago, and I've been pretty busy with a bunch of different assignments. I'm a little bit stretched thin here, but I really wanted to be able to write about that because when he first mentioned a gender pay gap within their local, and not only that, but he mentioned when he was surveying workers last year to kind of figure out priorities for negotiations, that was the number one issue within their local, was closing that gender pay gap, even above, higher wages in general. So, and I hadn't seen any reporting on that. So before I published my story, Truth Out actually did their own story on it as well. But
yeah, and you can find, and I'm looking at that here, the title is We're Not Birds and Mice, Costuming Cast Members Want Disney World to Close the Gender Pay Gap. You can find that by McKenna Schueler on the Orlando Weekly. And I have read some of that, and it's, and what are some of the, the cost of living stuff? What were some of the stories that you were able to uncover about, these wages and, not being able to cover their living expenses?
Yeah, so something to understand about Central Florida is, for one thing, across the state of Florida, average rent has gone up, I believe, 36% since 2020. And then the Central Florida region, which is the Orlando kind of region, it is, an average like 30% rent increase from 2020. Some people have reported just hundreds of dollars of in their rent increases. And it's increasingly more difficult to buy a home these days as well. But even like one person I talked to, she has a home, but she lives like an hour away to go to work. And then it's an hour and a half, 2 hours back. Plus with gas prices skyrocketing over the last year, there was that. Sorry, I feel like I'm rambling a little bit.
No,
Can you
no,
remind
you're
me
fine.
of your question, Jacob?
Yeah. I was interested in knowing some of the personal stories about the difficulties that that these workers had faced in the increase in the cost of living with the wages that they were getting at Disney.
Yeah, so I did luckily have the opportunity. I think what really made this story so special was that I was able to meet with a group of like 10 workers after their shifts one day a couple of weeks ago. We met at a local park kind of near their costuming warehouse. And some of the cast members, employees were there just kind of like in solidarity, and they didn't really talk to me necessarily, but they were just there to show support and to show that they cared about this issue, the gender pay gap that is. And of the people that I did talk to, I mean, they reported similar things as far as just these huge rent hikes, and none of the costuming workers that I know of reported necessarily being homeless, although there have been cast members across the parks that have reported seeing coworkers sleeping in their cars and such. But, it's a lot of people, just like a lot of people living in one's like 4 to 5 cast members in one place, just rooming up. It's a scramble. Like it's a huge issue that's affecting the whole region. And the Central Florida economy is dependent upon this low wage tourist and service economy. So it's something that, at Disney World, they're very lucky to have this union. Not everybody has that, but it is just a sort of regional issue.
Right. Well,
before we switch gears, I wanted to ask, and I wanted to point out, first of all, that this is affecting about 40,000 workers. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's somewhere between, I think, 42 to 45,000 workers.
That's just huge. And how many unions are there as part of this process? Because I know there's quite a few.
Yeah, there's 6 unions, and I have it listed somewhere if I can find it. It's IATSE Local 631, Teamsters Local, Transportation Communications Union, and UFCW, and a couple Unite Here locals. And I think the Unite Here locals actually cover maybe the majority or just a higher percentage of the workers, but it's everybody from like people who are working in attractions, costuming, lifeguards, guest services, bus drivers, just across the board, a lot of, 42 to 45,000 workers.
Wow. That's huge. I mean, this is going to change the entire community, really, by lifting up these folks. That's gonna have a positive impact everywhere. And so
yeah, I mean, absolutely. Think about the idea of 40,000 people. Obviously not everybody is going to be getting the $3 an hour exactly, but a lot of these 40,000 people are going to be getting a double-digit wage increase in one defined area. I mean, that's for the local, we understand that trickle down is more or less bunk, but the multiplier effect that you do get in a local economy when more working people have the money to spend is really, I think that this is going to be good for the entire community.
Yeah, no, I mean, actually, we saw that with the last cycle. The Orlando Sentinel actually reported on this pretty closely. I lived in Tampa at the time, so I wasn't covering this, but we saw with the last cycle when they raised the minimum wage to $15 effective 2021, but the contract was negotiated, I believe, 2018. After Disney ratified that contract, we saw Universal and SeaWorld, which are not unionized, still followed suit and began starting to raise their wages. So it is something that really sets a standard in the region. So it is incredibly important in that respect.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so let's shift gears then and talk about some of the political situation in Florida. I think DeSantis is more or less a household name at this point. And one of the things that he is doing is attacking unions in Florida. What are some of the ways that he's attacking labor down there?
So, I mean, one of his number one, I shouldn't say his number one enemy, but a big enemy of DeSantis is the teachers' unions. I mean, he's waged the war on the teachers' unions. They all went behind his opponent, Charlie Crist, last year. Charlie Crist's running mate was a teachers' union president herself. But in January of this year, DeSantis unveiled this so-called Teachers' Bill of Rights that was just a blatant attack on teachers' unions. And then within a couple months, Republican lawmakers introduced legislation that doesn't just target teachers' unions, it targets public sector unions at large, with the exception of unions representing firefighters, cops, corrections staff, and probation officers, which should be mentioned. This is yeah, the unions that traditionally endorse and give a lot of campaign cash to Republicans, including the bill sponsor of the Senate bill, which is advancing the fastest. That bill sponsor alone has received at least $15,000 from police unions since 2020. I did a little bit digging the other day. But so this legislation, I should mention, like it's been introduced, like similar iterations have been introduced since 2011 when Matt Gaetz was bringing forth that legislation. And so what this legislation specifically would do would place a ban on automatic dues deduction, and similar but even worse than last year's version, the bill would impose a 60% membership threshold, where in Florida, teachers' unions are already required to meet a 50% threshold under a bill signed into law in 2018. But everybody I've spoken to, has said it's hard to reach a 60% threshold in a right-to-work state. And there are unions that have reached and surpassed the 60% threshold, but there has been just a wave of opposition to this legislation. The only support for it is the only open support, I should say, is coming from representatives of conservative think tanks. So
right. Of course. And that and all of these bills anywhere, bills like this have not only historically been introduced in Florida, but they have been historically and contemporaneously introduced all across the country by, right-wing anti-labor freaks. And they always do basically the same thing. And they always have an exception for cops. And that really goes to show that this is not about individual freedom. It's not about individual liberty or an individual Bill of Rights. It is simply and totally naked power grabbing. Rewarding.
I should say,
yeah.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I should say, he's been pushed on that too, as far as the exemption. That was one of the first questions I asked him, because he argues, the Senate bill sponsor, that is, argues it's a pro-union piece of legislation because it will force union bosses to have more face-to-face conversations with their union members or workers to maintain or reach that threshold, and to have more conversations when, if there's a ban on dues deduction. He keeps bringing up this thing about how, I guess I should say, his explanation for why he is exempting the cops, the firefighters, the correction staff is they are a, quote, special class of workers who work long hours, sometimes second and third shifts. And repeatedly, he's mentioned he doesn't want these workers who are risking their lives working second and third shifts to have to go to a union rep after work to give them their check. And the backlash that he's received about that has been just incredible. Before he was even asked by lawmakers in committee stops, I talked to a few union members, specifically teachers and faculty members, on the phone, and I repeated that explanation to them because the first time I reached out to the Senate bill sponsor, he emailed me back. He hasn't since. But But I read that to them, and there's a lot of workers in the public sector that are working very long hours. Particularly, one example that I hadn't really thought of before people were starting to bring it up is resident physicians and nurses at public hospitals in the state of Florida, some of whom are working upwards of 80 hours a week, and they depend on their union. But especially the resident physicians, they've brought up that because of how residency works, it would be pretty much impossible for them to reach and maintain that 60% threshold because of the turnover in their union. So they would risk decertification, and as a result, they would lose their union contract if that decertification went into effect. Right.
Yeah, it's just totally a naked power grab, rewarding political allies and trying to hurt political enemies, and it's really, really, really gross. But you mentioned in your piece that was published just yesterday, Florida's anti-union bill could risk over $500 million in federal funds. So talk to us. There's this, obviously the anti-union piece of it, despite, the insistence that it's pro-union, obviously the impact on unions would be negative. But there's also there's an interesting fiscal component to the effects of this bill. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so before I even get to the big one, a Senate bill analysis for the Senate version estimates that just the recertification process for unions that fall below 60% would cost the state an estimated over $900,000. So there's that, which is known. But the thing that I've been trying to report on a little bit more over the past week, which I'm honestly surprised has not been reported on before, as far as I know, especially because similar legislation has been proposed in for the past decade, and maybe in older years there was some reporting on it, but I haven't been able to find it, is a claim by, it came from the Amalgamated Transit Union first, which represents about 6,000 transit workers in the state of Florida. And they've been emailing lawmakers and bringing up, they've also emailed the Department of Labor about this as well to confirm or just to see if this is true. But they say that if this bill passed, because of they say that if this bill would pass, it would risk over $500 million in federal transit funds for the state of Florida in this year alone, in the next year, because of employee protections under the Federal Transit Act. And that includes the preservation of rights and benefits of employees under existing collective bargaining agreements, the continuation of collective bargaining rights, the protection of individual employees against a worsening of their positions in relation to their employment. So the union argues that the ban on dues deduction, for instance, would infringe upon their right to bargain for that. And if the unions were decertified, then they argue that that would also violate the protections within the Federal Transit Act. And so because of all the money flowing in from the Biden infrastructure bill, the unions say that could be at risk for the state of Florida. And I know even where I am in Orlando, that's $43 million in this year alone. But
wow.
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure I broke the story on that last week, I think. But it's starting to make the rounds. And there was actually a Republican lawmaker on Thursday who finally brought it up with the bill sponsor, and he denied it. Then when he was pushed on it further, he said that he would double check to make sure. He argued that under the law, workers don't have to be protected by, a collective bargaining agreement. It can be just any sort of protective agreement. And I'm not sure that's true. He brought up, there are public transit workers in other states that have outright, banned collective bargaining rights for public sector workers. There are transit workers there that the systems do get funding. But so I still honestly, to be fully transparent, I'm not entirely sure if that would happen, if all of that money would be entirely at risk. But it seems, based on communications I've read between the union, the ATU, and the DOL, And what I've heard from various people within the ATU that I've talked to, it seems like the claim, the risk of losing all that money does have merit.
Interesting. Yeah, that's definitely, that's a fascinating point in that story. Are there any other anti-union bills that are coming from the Florida's legislature or being proposed by the governor?
I mean, that's the most explicitly anti-union, but there's also a few other bills that affect labor. For instance, there's a bill, probably the next most closely linked is HB 917. It's called vaguely state minimum wage, but essentially what it would do is carve out minor league players from Florida's minimum wage, which is currently $11 per hour. And there's a reporter, Jason Garcia, who's been doing a lot of good reporting on that. But the sad thing too is that bill is actually advancing as well, which is just incredible to think about, that you would do something like that when there are already a lot of minor leaguers that have reported poverty wage conditions.
Wow. Yeah, that's really, really wild. And Florida is a state without a Department of Labor, I learned from your piece, because there's legislation to try to reestablish a state Department of Labor after it was dismantled by Governor Jeb Bush.
Yeah, so I learned about that last year. I'm pretty sure it was last year when I was doing some reporting on wage theft, because the State Department of Labor used to investigate those things. But because Florida no longer has a State Department of Labor, there is some sort of like economic agency. Wage theft is just incredibly widespread, and there's little to no enforcement because that goes through the Florida Attorney General, who, as far as a couple of policy experts I've talked to, they say they don't really enforce it. And then the other option is to go to the federal government. But the federal government, the DOL, can only enforce the federal minimum wage, which is a lot lower than Florida's. So that's a huge issue. But yeah, so there's been a legislation the past couple of years by, I think, the same couple people. There's actually a local Senator Victor Torres, who's a current dues-paying union member, who has proposed legislation over the past couple of years to reestablish a State Department of Labor. And there's also a House equivalent as well. But of course, that legislation is languishing because we don't need anything like that. We don't need wage theft enforcement or minimum wage enforcement at all.
Of course, of course. McKenna Schueler, reporter for the Orlando Weekly, thank you for taking the time to talk to us. Is there anything else that folks ought to know about? And if not, where's the best place for folks to find you?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of bad bills this session targeting public education, faculty, a lot of anti-queer, anti-trans bills, which intersect with labor rights. I've been trying to do reporting on that, but there's a lot of good reporters in Florida that are trying to keep on this. As far as my reporting, you can find me and my work at orlandoweekly.com, and I'm on Twitter way too often at @SheCarriesOn. So thank you so much for inviting me on. I'm so happy to be here, by the way.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming on, McKenna. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.